The scripture lesson today comes from Genesis, one of the stories of the patriarchs familiar to us all, from the 27th chapter. When Isaac was so old that his eyesight had failed, he summoned his older child Esau and said, "My child." "Here I am," answered Esau. And then Isaac said, "As you can see, I am so old that I could die at any time. Take your gear, your quiver, your bow, and go out into the country and hunt me some game. Prepare a tasty dish for me, the kind I like, and bring it to me to eat, and I will give you my special blessing before I die." Rebekah overheard the conversation while Isaac was talking to Esau. So when Esau left for the wilds to hunt for game for Isaac, she said to Jacob, "I just overheard Isaac tell Esau, your brother, 'Bring me some game and make a tasty dish for me to eat. I intend to bless you in Yahweh's presence before I die.' Now listen closely, Jacob, and do what I tell you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 choice kids, and I'll cook them specially for Isaac. You then take it to your father so that he will give you his blessing before he dies." Jacob said to Rebekah, "But Esau is hairy, and I am smooth-skinned. What if Isaac touches me? I'll be trickster in his eyes, and I'll bring down a curse upon myself instead of a blessing." Rebekah answered, "Let your curse fall on me, my son. Now do as I say. Go fetch the kids." So Jacob fetched the kids and gave them to Rebekah, and she prepared a delicacy, just as Isaac liked it. Then Rebekah took Esau's clothes, the best clothes she could find in the house, and gave them to her younger son Jacob to wear. And then she took the skins of the young goats and covered his hands and his hairless parts of his neck. Then she handed her younger son Jacob the tasty dish and the bread that she had prepared. And Jacob carried the tasty dish and the bread to Isaac. Jacob said, "Father." "Here I am," replied Isaac. "Which of my sons are you?" "I am Esau, your firstborn," Jacob replied. "I have done as you have told me. Here, sit up and eat some of the game so that you may give me your special blessing." "How did you find it so quickly, my child?" asked Isaac. Jacob replied, "It was Yahweh, God, your God, who let things turn out in my favor." Isaac told Jacob, "Come closer then, and let me touch you, so that I can tell if you really are Esau or not." Jacob moved close to Isaac, who touched him. "The voice is Jacob's," said Isaac, "but the hands are Esau's." Isaac was confused because Jacob's hands were hairy like Esau's, and in the end, Isaac gave Jacob his blessing. "Are you really Esau?" Isaac asked. Jacob replied, "I am." Isaac said, "Then bring me the game to eat, and I will give you my blessing." Jacob took Isaac the game to eat and some wine to drink. And then Isaac said, "Come closer, Esau, and kiss me." And Jacob approached Isaac and kissed him on the cheek. And when Isaac smelled Esau's scent on the clothes, he gave Jacob his blessing. Isaac said, "The scent of my hair is like the smell of a fertile field blessed by Yahweh. May God give you the dew from heaven and the richness of the earth and abundance of grain and wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down before you. Rule over your brothers and sisters, and let your mother's children bow down before you. Cursed are those who curse you. Blessed are those who bless you." When Isaac finished the blessing, Jacob left his father's presence just as Esau was returning from his hunting. And he too had prepared a tasty dish, which he took to Isaac, saying, "Isaac, sit up and eat the tasty dish I've prepared for you, so that you may give me your blessing." "Who are you?" Isaac asked. "I am Esau, your firstborn." Isaac, trembling greatly, said, "Then who was it that hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it just before you came in from hunting, and I blessed him. Now that blessing must remain on him." When Esau heard this, he cried bitterly and loudly. "Father, bless me too," he said. Isaac said, "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing." "He isn't called heel grabber for nothing," said Esau. "This isn't the first time he has deceived me. He usurped my right as the firstborn, and now he robs me of my blessing. But do you have no blessing for me?" And Isaac replied, "I have made Jacob elder over you, and set all his sisters and brothers under him. I provided him with wine and grain. What can I give you, Esau?" And Esau said, "Do you have only one blessing? Bless me as well, Father." And Esau wept loudly. Isaac replied to Esau, "Your dwelling place must be far from the earth's riches, far from the heavens' dew above. You will live by your sword, and you will serve Jacob. But the time will come when you will brandish that sword, and you will tear Jacob's yoke from your neck." The story of Jacob and Esau. History, they say, is written by the victors, those who come out on top, those who win the battles, those who conquer their foes. All of which to say is the formal record of any era stands not as an objective or a comprehensive account of what transpired during those years, but rather it's a carefully crafted version composed to make the winners appear heroic and virtuous. And in so doing, it reinforces the views and the values of the ruling class, aided as they always are by religious appeals and patriotic myths of the way things are. Just like when leaders end their speeches with the proverbial words, "God bless America." As a result, what people rally around, what they absorb as their national history, typically reflects only the perspective of those who are on the top, those who dominate a culture, those who perpetuate a specific heritage or language or religion or economic interest or political ideology. And there's a reason that history is penned by the winners and not the losers. But with every winner, there are many who are not. So what about these stories, which rarely are told? Experiences and perspectives of those whose voices have, for the most part, been silenced, those whose stories are unlikely to be shared. The late Howard Zinn asked questions like these in his remarkably insightful classic called A People's History of the United States, 1492 to the present. And in it, Zinn observes, and I quote, says, "What struck me as I began to study history was how nationalist fervor, inculcated from childhood on by pledges of allegiance and national anthems and flags waving and rhetoric blowing, permeated the educational systems of all countries, including our own." He goes on, he says, "I knew that a historian or a journalist or anyone telling a story was forced to choose out of an infinite number of facts what to present and what to omit. And that decision inevitably would reflect, whether conscious or not, the interests of the historian. But there is no such thing as pure fact, innocent of interpretation. Behind every fact presented to the world by a teacher, by a writer, or anyone, is a judgment. The judgment that has been made is that this fact is important, and that other facts omitted are not important. And so in his opening chapters, Zinn then explored how the standard historical accounts of early American life chronicled the experiences of European settlers, while others were entirely ignored or left unmentioned. And this even factored into the formation of the country itself as to who had standing and who did not. Zinn goes on, he says, the inferior position of blacks, the exclusion of Indians from this new society, the establishment of supremacy for the rich and powerful in the new nation, all this was already settled in the colonies by the time of the American Revolution. With the English out of the way, it could now be put on paper, solidified, regularized, made legitimate by the Constitution of the United States. And when economic interest is seen behind the political clauses of the Constitution, then the document becomes not simply the work of wise men trying to establish a decent and orderly society, but the work of certain groups trying to maintain their privileges while giving just enough rights and liberties to enough of the people to ensure popular support. Zinn goes on, he says, my viewpoint in telling the history of the United States is different. That we must not blindly accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals the fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, but often repressed, between conquerors and the conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus has suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners. And that's something to think about this week, isn't it? What Zinn highlighted in his book was the part of American history that typically remains untold, at least to the vast majority anyway. And the reason for hearing these unknown stories is because they eventually do get told, but in other ways, often expressed in violent acts of rebellion against the state, something that impacts us now even in the present, in the conflicts and the crises of our time, in the battles between protesters and police, in the voices and faces of angry and exasperated minorities, and in the growing realization that the citizens of this country are not equal under the law. And only in recent decades has the American public been exposed to other stories historically dismissed and ignored, narratives which reveal the insidious truth about white racism amidst the cruel symbols reminding them of slavery and the Confederacy, as well as in the growing awareness that heroes of the European heritage, such as Christopher Columbus, were not, in fact, the noble characters our school book history portrayed them to be. And in these very days, friends, the Black Lives Matter movement and their allies are forcing our country to come to terms with long-standing crimes of injustice largely ignored by the white majority up to this day. Now, I will admit my own ignorance of some of these stories as I watch century-old monuments being toppled from their pedestals. The great evil of human slavery wasn't a part of my family history or heritage. So I've not fully entered into the depths of its cruelty. I haven't grasped the stinging shame associated with it. And yet, in a very real and, I would say, uncomfortable way, I realized I was still complicit to it in my ignorance. As you know, I grew up in Maine, where we would celebrate June 14th, for instance, Flag Day, as we did this past week, celebrating the cherished symbol of freedom with the story of Betsy Ross creating and then presenting the first flag to George Washington, And that was history as I knew it. And yet, years later, I learned there was no evidence of this story being true. It's only a myth, a patriotic legend that actually arose in the late 19th century, a creation of culture not unlike the tale of Washington cutting down the cherry tree. Neither one of them happened. And yet, from childhood on, it was part of my understanding of American history. And yet, never once did I hear a single reference to something that, in fact, was true, commemorated a few days later on June 19th, more commonly called Juneteenth, the date in 1865 when Emancipation Proclamation was finally delivered to Texas, Texas being the last Confederate slave state to have it read to the people it was intended to free. But it was 2.5 years after it had become law on January 1st, 1863, and 2 months following the surrender of the Confederacy at Appomattox. And of course, I read and knew about Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, but Juneteenth as a day to commemorate, that wasn't included in my public school education. I was later told that it was Black history, not my history. And yes, as a part of the white majority, I was taught fancifully false tales about our patriotic figures rather than hearing the untold story of a crucial moment in American history, something that I now believe should be universally recognized and commemorated, as much as July 4th. So the question is, whose history was I taught? Whose story was I missing? I also recall celebrating Columbus Day with an annual parade and school holiday, and I was taught to believe that Columbus was one of those who was the one, in fact, who discovered America in his quest to find passage to the East Indies. In fact, part of his legacy was in mischaracterizing indigenous people as Indians, only because he was in the wrong part of the world. But as a child, I could easily recite what I knew about this heroic explorer, the basic story of the 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, voyaging from Spain across the Atlantic, and Columbus discovering the New World on October 12, 1492. Except, no one told me that it wasn't Columbus, but instead it was the captain of the Pinta who actually made the discovery, and who deserved the lifetime pension King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had offered for the one who was first to spot land. And the story is that Columbus cheated him out of it by claiming credit. Nor was I informed about the exploitation, the genocidal cruelty that accompanied Columbus's conquest of indigenous people, even to the point of being sanctioned and returned to Spain in chains for his excessive brutality and incompetence as a slave-trading tyrant. And we were having a parade for someone like this. Is that what white Americans are supposed to celebrate? Well, you can, if you're only taught the myth, not the reality. So what then is American history? Who should write it? Who should tell the story? And in many cases, the truth is in the story that's left untold. That's left untold. And that's important to acknowledge, since we're now in a time of significant cultural reckoning. And that is one of the perplexing troubles associated with patriotic legends and collective memory. In the words of Zinn, cultural myths serve unwittingly to justify what was done. And we now inherit the bitter legacy of such injustice almost nightly on the news. Frankly, that is the fundamental crime of any standardized history, wherever it originates. Disguising the truth to protect the powerful, to appease the winners. And what is presented and passed along as truth may not be, based on what has been left untold, overlooked, forgotten. And so with every account we hear or every chronicle that we read, we should begin by asking, who does this story belong to? Where does it come from? Who does it benefit? Who does it validate? Who does it justify? Who does this story harm or marginalize or completely ignore? Because stories, friends, stories are never benign in terms of how they impact those who are ignored and what they define as truth as it pertains to national or racial identity or religious beliefs and cultural values that we hold as people. Once we claim to know the truth, that's when we should always seek to know what's yet untold. Well, very simply, I've learned not to take stories at face value, even biblical texts and passages. As much as tradition claims the Bible is the inspired Word of God, there are stories there that should make us squirm, and question, what does it mean? Or is it even true? We have to remember the Bible didn't drop onto us out of the sky. It's a constructed history involving a limited number of people. Plus, within the canon itself, there are competing stories, particularly in the stories of the patriarchs, those that come from the perspective of the northern kingdom of Israel and those that derive from the southern view of Judah, they who were rivals for divine truth and blessing. And really, it's probably not unlike what we find in our own country when you have depictions of the Civil War and the resulting legacies. They differ depending on if the history is written by someone with sympathies north of the Mason-Dixon line or someone south of it. In other words, history isn't everyone's story. And so again, it's incumbent upon us to ask and wonder, whose story is ignored in the pages of the biblical text? And there must be many. This is particularly relevant, as I said, when reading the stories of the patriarchs, as in our text today about Jacob and Esau. And it really isn't hard to figure out whose story is told here. It's quite evident. It's Jacob. It's Jacob's story. It's from that perspective. Esau is barely mentioned, or at least with anything to empathize with him or validates his existence or his descendants. What we have is the Jacob perspective. And why is that? Because the stories of Jacob represent the history of people of Judah, where they gained their identity apart from others. However, what's odd about this passage, this story, is that according to tradition, it shouldn't read as it does. Customary to ancient times, and you know this, it should be Esau as firstborn son who receives the blessing of his father Isaac. Esau was the one to inherit the family mantle and the significance and material of goods and property and recognition. Family lineages typically were passed on through the firstborn sons. All others were on their own or were subject to serving the head of the family, that being, of course, the firstborn. So why then does this story make the claim that Jacob received the blessing? Would it have been viewed as legitimate? Unlikely, except by those whose interests it served. If it was attained through cunning and deceit, what would that say about Jacob's descendants? That they were cheaters? Or that they were politically astute and opportunistic? What do you think? What do you think? At the same time, we should ask, is this really a depiction of an actual moment? Or was it a cultural myth that was read back into time as a narrative intended to justify and validate Judah's racial and political superiority? And that, my friends, is a very good question to ask. For instance, how might this story have been told if it were done by the descendants of Esau? who should have been the rightful heirs. They were, according to Bible tradition anyway, the Edomites, Semitic people who lived in the southern Negev region, who rivaled Judah through much of its existence, especially after the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722 BCE. Generations later, after Judah itself was left in ruins by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, cast into their exile, the Edomites sought to expand to the north and settle into the land that Judah had possessed and now was deprived of. Interesting, Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein explains the interests at stake for the exiled people of Judah, who at the time were beginning to compose, in written form anyway, the very text that would come to define their history. Finkelstein writes this. He says, after the destruction of Judah, Edomites settled in the southern parts of the vanquished kingdom. Drawing a boundary between us, that being the post-exilic community in Judah, and them, the Edomites in the southern hill country, was of utmost importance, demonstrating, as it did in the story of Jacob and Esau, that Judah was the superior center and that Edom was secondary and uncivilized, was therefore essential. So then, this story of Jacob and Esau, with Jacob receiving the blessing of his father, really had more to do with defining the superiority of one people over the other than with offering any credible historical portrait of Judah's history as a people. It was a myth. It was a myth read back into time to justify their eventual repossession of Jerusalem and the lands that they had lost. And as this story would depict, they, the Judahites, not the Edomites, would rightfully, though deceitfully, claim the birthright and the inheritance of the promised land through the divine blessing. It's a story that clearly served the interests of Ezra and Nehemiah, who were leading the way in return out of exile. The writer of this portion of biblical history simply complied with those wishes, and that's what happens. This is precisely why it's prudent to explore any story of history and ask what interests are at stake and who benefits from this. Whose story is told and whose is not. Now we can apply this forward to the present. And what does it suggest about our own beliefs about history? What do the standard stories say about whose interests were at stake and who sought power and the benefits of this land? I think we all know the answer to those questions, which is why we now face a time of reckoning with the selective view of history many of us commonly hold. Our national story, from its origins, tends to be reflective of those who were on the top, leaving out much of what actually happened, at least in the fullest sense of it. And if anyone questions the reality of white racism, all you need do is have them recite then the history of the indigenous people or black history. And their ability to do so or not will reveal how much of it they share or care about. The legacy of white domination, my friends, is so expansive and is now only 250 years nearly since the founding as a nation, now shifting enough to allow others into the same space. It is said that one cannot return to the past and start a new beginning. But it is possible to set out today to make for a better ending. And I hope that is the case for our country here in this 2020 year of clarity and vision. Perhaps even for the entire world. Many of the essential things that have propped up and reinforced injustices for generation upon generation are being called out and being held into account. The monuments of the past are coming down. And it's about time. It's about time. And it's also time for us as part of the white majority to listen more and speak less, to empathize with those whose voices have been silenced, whose stories have not yet been told. It's long overdue for us to stand aside and allow those who look to the past and do not fawn over them as being the good old days, because they're the ones who will lead us to seek better days ahead. This is a time of unmasking the truth of our varied histories and identities. And for God to truly bless our land, we must be certain that there is no one, that there is no race, that there is no population, no person, no place that's left behind and excluded from the story of our people. The story of our people that even now is waiting to be told. Let us pray together. In the days of our lives, in the current events of our time, it's often true that we simply absorb them as events whose meaning will pass away. We won't remember in another year or two what happened. But there's something about this time that's different. There's something about its restlessness and its spirit and its transforming power that it will not only not be forgotten, it will utterly change us. And when those times of transformation have happened throughout civilization, for the better especially, it's often the power of God that is attributed to inspire and lead us to a better place. And if that is true for us in these days, may we join the side of those seeking justice and not find ourselves among the executioners. This is our prayer. May it be so.